we are in a special place founded by Ben Franklin. The founders of our nation really had a strong commitment to the value of information, of facts, of science, of rational thought to inform the public debate. So we've gone all in on Ben Franklin. I don't know if you've noticed that, but so without further ado, Ethan Zuckerman.
Good morning. This is a talk about two Bens and a Mark. And I assume the first one is pretty obvious to you. I'm a Franklin fan. A number of people have observed there might be a resemblance. I've never actually noticed it myself. But people tell me that you can see it if you squint. But I will say that if you were going to have a favorite founding father, Ben is not a bad choice. He wasn't just an inventor, he wasn't just a scientist, he was a printer, he was the postmaster, a skilled diplomat. What this is really about, though, is he was a hustler. Ben was all about figuring out how to make a name and how to make a buck within America. And one of the things that he figured out was the way to have political and fiscal power in the early colonies was to control the means of communication. And so the job that he had the longest was as postmaster. He starts in Philadelphia in 1737. He actually holds the job of Postmaster General of the colonies until 1774, which is really crazy because he's one of the major revolutionary figures and he still manages to get away with it despite doing stuff that pretty obviously would get you into trouble. So Franklin, because he's postmaster, has what's called franking privileges. He can write free and get his mail sent wherever he wants. So a lot of letters say free Ben Franklin. The trick is later in Franklin's days, he starts writing this slightly differently, be free Franklin. And you might think that if you have a bunch of colonies in rebellion and the postmaster is literally writing insurrectionist thoughts on the mail as he's sending it, you might get those guys out of the way, but the British were not always all that quick on the uptake. So here's the thing. Free mail, subversive messages, this was part of what Ben enjoyed about this job. But what he really enjoyed about it was that it was this amazing way to hand out patronage jobs to his friends. Lots and lots of Franklin family members ended up working for the early Postal Service. But also, Ben figured out how to leverage the family business, which was printing, and leverage it with the post office into this sort of synergistic business enterprise that turned out to have some very interesting implications for the United States. Before Ben is postmaster in the colonies, there's a really interesting problem if you're a printer. If you end up printing material that the local postmaster doesn't like, the local postmaster does not deliver your printed material. This is not a neutral carrier. Ben shows up and he does something that is surprisingly progressive, and unsurprising if you know Franklin, it also makes him a bunch of money. He basically says, look, we're going to charge you one low fee for carriage. We do not care what we're carrying, and we're simply going to make it possible for you to print whatever you want, and we are not going to step in and act as a censor. What results from this is a really interesting phenomenon. You guys have probably heard of Habermas. Habermas writes about how the public sphere emerges in Europe. It's from coffee houses. The bourgeois get together. They talk. They end up becoming a counterforce that can sort of fight back against, the excesses of the king. That's not what happens in the U.S. We have an entirely different public sphere. Our public sphere is a public sphere of print. It's distributed. It's happening in the newspapers that get passed back and forth between all of the colonies. And to be perfectly honest, this is the only public sphere that makes any sense for a nation that at this point spans from Boston to Charleston at a moment when the fastest anyone can travel is by horse. You can't get everybody together in Philadelphia or New York and have a conversation about how you're going to govern a nation. You have to have a distributed asynchronous public sphere. And this is probably the most brilliant thing that Franklin ends up doing. The interesting thing, though, is that the way that we really see the power of this sphere is not from that Ben, but from this Ben. Benjamin Rush, this is a founder, a signer of the Constitution, signer of the Declaration of Independence, Philadelphian, not well known. Actually really hard to dig up a biography on this guy. The reason this guy is a bit of a hero is not his accomplishments in being one of America's first physicians, but the fact that he passed one of the most fascinating pieces of legislation in early American history, 1792. It's the Post Office Act, and it's subtle, and it's weird, and it's really crazy. What the Post Office Act does is establishes the right of the government to control postal routes. It gives citizens a right to privacy within their mail. This is not something you have in England at this point or in France. The government can absolutely read your mail. And by the way, this gets overturned by the Alien Sedition Acts almost immediately after, but who's counting? We get back to it. We come back to it. But what's really, really interesting is that Rush sets up this crazy system of cross-subsidies. Sending letters in early America, pretty expensive. And the reason it's so expensive is that they are subsidizing the exchange of newspapers. It's almost free to send a newspaper back and forth. In fact, newspapers are so cheap that if you're broke, the best way to send word home is to buy a newspaper, take a pin, put pricks under the words in your message, and then mail it back to mom. Because the newspaper costs about a fifth of what it costs to send a letter. So by the time we're in the 1830s, newspapers are representing 85% of the weight of the mail, 15% of the revenue. This is a conscious choice. This is a conscious decision, along with the fact that we didn't have stamp taxes, we didn't have caution money, which made it impossible for people to print. This was a way to get to the point where essentially half of all American households had a newspaper subscription. And having a newspaper subscription, by the way, this is like 20x, maybe 50x what you're seeing in England at this point. What you have in a newspaper subscription is not really what we think of as a newspaper now. It's actually much more like having access to the internet. And the reason for this is the craziest subsidy that Rush puts into place is something called the exchange copy. The exchange copy allows you to send newspapers back and forth for free. If you are publishing a newspaper, you can send copies of your newspaper to any other newspaper in the country, and it is completely subsidized. You pay no money to send it back and forth. This is so widely used that by 1830, the average newspaper in the United States is receiving 4,300 copies per year from other papers. They have giant rooms just filled with other people's news, and they are not aggressively enforcing copyright. And so what these newspapers look like at this point is basically those newspaper clippings that your parents send you. They're clipping them out of other newspapers. They're retypesetting them. And your local newspaper is basically, here is the news of the world based on the people who have sent us these newspapers. And once again, this is not by accident. This is a decision that this is the system that we're going to live within. So by 1835, we have this incredible postal system. 80% of federal jobs in the United States by 1830 are with the post office. The United States in 1830 is a postal system with a very small representative government overseeing it and an itty-bitty little army trying to keep it safe from the other big powers out there. We are first and foremost a republic of print, a republic of ideas, a republic of messages being spread back and forth, and we have to be, because no one else has tried this idea of governing a country from its citizens and letting those citizens try to make those decisions. And you can see this with things like rural free delivery and mail, or the fact that in Massachusetts, my home state, in 1831, there's 400 post offices. It's only 351 towns in Massachusetts, and this is the 1830s, so you're doing this entirely on horseback. So let me just be really clear about this. I am not a Franklin expert. I am not a media expert. I am not an American historian. If anything, I study digital communications. I read a lot of books. These two are really terrific if you actually want to find out what the history is of the post office and the press and sort of early American communication. But the reason I give this talk every year to my students is that it's really important to understand how unusual the public sphere in the United States is. We evolve very, very differently than England, than France, than all of these other nations because we have to. And we end up prefiguring, in many ways, some of the problems that we end up experiencing today. And so the challenge that I really wanted to take on here was to ask this question of how someone like Franklin, who thought really deeply and in sophisticated ways about the media environment we need to support democracy, might deal with some of the problems that we're facing today: polarization, fake news, the notion that social media might actually be tearing us apart instead of bringing us together. And what I really want to say about this is a lot of these ideas that we are freaked out about are actually not remotely new. So the first one is the idea that this public sphere is a commercial public sphere. You'll hear a lot of people reacting to Facebook and saying, this is terrible. We cannot possibly have a commercial provider responsible for our public spaces to speak. And I sort of agree with this, except for the fact that we always have. This was not a government-free space. Again, remember, I'm talking about big government subsidies. But this was absolutely a free market space. And it is impossible to overemphasize how much advertising and how much commercial content built this public sphere of the press that I'm talking about. Early newspapers were anywhere from 70 to 90% advertising. This is why so many of the newspapers that we know today are called the advertiser. It was their market, first and foremost. And people set up print shops not because they really wanted to tell you the news. They added in the news because it was a way to sell what was essentially a classified ad broadsheet to everybody within there. What is new is this notion that we as a government, we as a people, would decide that we could not interfere with the free market functioning of these institutions. This idea that these spaces have to be completely deregulated, this corporate libertarian stance, that would have been very surprising to our founding fathers. Because again, they very explicitly broke in and said the government's function is going to be to create the postal system, which was necessary for this print system to flourish. And we were actually going to cross-subsidize to make certain forms of communication cheaper than others, and we would jump in and regulate if we needed to. Now, how about this question of the inclusivity of the public sphere? Is the problem that with the rise of Facebook, suddenly everybody gets to talk, and suddenly we have no control over what's going on? And what I would say is, again, this really isn't an unfamiliar problem. This notion of people being able to say whatever they want, the truth is all you really needed was a printer who would put your words on paper. And a huge amount of what's coming out as journalism in the 1700s and the early 1800s is pure, unvarnished personal opinion. Most of these papers are frankly pretty desperate for content. If you write reasonably well and you show up with a manuscript, there's a decent chance it's going to end up in the paper. And like I said before, you have this enormous exchange of information going back and forth. So the editors are gatekeepers. They're basically swimming in the sea of exchange copies of newspapers. They're swimming in the sea of local content of people who, by the way, are not often signing their names. They're usually writing under pseudonyms, including Ben, who really liked to pretend that he was a woman when he wrote because it was a way to get an emotive response to a lot of the stuff that he was putting out there. So it was not a golden age of people standing up under their own good name and sort of writing in formal ways. It was lots and lots of very questionable, often very low quality, quite partisan writing with the notion of a gatekeeper that was trying to filter this and give you some sort of perspective coming out of it. What might be different today is that the gatekeepers within the algorithms, right? The gatekeepers within Facebook sort of deciding you want to see this, you don't want to see this, are suddenly personalizing all of this. And Eli Pariser, who's up next, is going to end up talking a little bit about this. He's done great work on this. But this may lead us to a very different view of the world rather than a single entity that we can look at and essentially say, well, at least we've all got that in common. Ideological isolation? Not new. So one of the really interesting things when you look at America is sort of how late political parties develop. It's clearly one of the things that the founders are deeply worried about. You can see that partisanship is something that they're really terrified of. They really don't love the notion that there might be multiple parties sort of yelling at each other. It's not built into the Constitution. It's not built into the early federal system. It emerges, and frankly, it emerges from newspapers. Political parties in the 1800s are basically newspapers that grow a political apparatus on top of them. Doesn't happen the other way around. When we talk about the party press, it's the press that comes first. The party comes second. One of the things that's interesting about this, though, is that everybody knows this. If you are reading the New York Evening Post in 1801, you know damn well that that is Alexander Hamilton's newspaper. And you know that that is a Federalist newspaper and that it's very, very much going to be anti-Jefferson. It's going to have very, very strong feelings about debt and about a central bank. It's going to advocate for all of those things that Hamilton now flamboyantly advocates for on stage. And you're well aware of that. This sort of moment of the view from nowhere, which people like to call journalistic objectivity, bullshit. No one's doing this at this point. They're very much giving their opinion from a particular point of view. And that leads to extremely heated debates that are both happening in person and in the press. So again, this is a moment where we look at this and say, it's a fractious world out there. It's so partisan. People can't talk to one another. Guys, not news. This has been happening for a very, very long time. And having ideological isolation within a press, that's the norm. That's actually not a new phenomenon. That's basically the phenomenon with sort of the exception of the quote-unquote golden age from maybe 1910 through 1980, 1990, which is not exactly a golden age in many ways. It's a golden age that excludes a lot of women. It excludes a lot of people of color. One of the things that's really interesting in this period is that within this extremely fractious moment, you do see publications coming that are very specific, coming from one perspective or another. You see Friedman's journals coming out. You see journals coming out that are frankly, aiming quite explicitly at women. But I want to go a little bit further back in time to talk about the last thing that is not a new phenomenon, which is that fake news is not new. Okay? So we're going to do a little refresher here. I know that everyone here has studied the English Civil War in detail, but I just want to make sure that we're all completely up to speed on it. English Civil War happens in the 1640s when King Charles does something unheard of. He marries a Catholic. And this goes over so badly that Parliament basically says, hey, Charles, we don't trust you, we don't like you, we're going to block whatever you do. And Charles says, that's interesting. Turns out I summon Parliament. I wonder what happens if I don't summon you. And he didn't for 9 years. And two things happen. One is that Parliament gets really, really pissed off at Charles. And the second is that Charles basically goes broke. And when Scotland says, I think we could invade down there. That shouldn't be a problem. They don't actually have an army that they can afford. They come in. Charles finds himself in utter and total crisis. And this, of course, leads to Charles being beheaded. And then there's no more monarchy. And then you suddenly have the rise of Parliament. And suddenly Oliver Cromwell is Lord Protector of the Realm. And then there's the Irish Genocide. And then eventually there's the Restoration where that little kid there, Charles II, sort of stands up and becomes monarch again. You know all that. What you may have forgotten in all of this was that as Charles is losing grips on the reins of power, he can't censor the press anymore. And this is really interesting, because in 1641, there is more published in the city of London than is published in the 150 years preceding. So since the printing press has come to London, this many books. 1641, this many books. And these books are crazy. This is where this moment of incredible religious radicalism comes out of England. You have the levelers, you have the diggers, you have all these folks who have these absolutely crackpot religious ideas. You may remember them, we call them founding fathers. Many of them went on boats to come over here and pursue them because they're so nuts. You also have incredible political satire going back and forth. You have completely scurrilous accusations. The biggest thing you have at this point are news books. Let's talk about news books. This is one of the most successful ones. This is the Moderate Intelligencer. You'll note that it is impartially communicating martial affairs to the Kingdom of England. I don't know, that reminds me of someone's motto about being fair and balanced, but back even in the 1640s, this was a thing. These are thinly sourced forms of journalism. They're wrong a good chunk of the time. It's really hard to get information back and forth. These papers often say things like, the king is dead, Parliament has taken control, or Cromwell is dead and the king has taken back control, or Scotland has invaded, and no one quite knows who to believe, except for the fact that there's two rival camps of these. The parliamentarians have theirs, the royalists have theirs. They both say that the other one is lying. They keep sending information back and forth. And then the other crazy thing behind this is that the thing that sells better than anything else is Catholic conspiracy theories. It turns out that this marginalized minority group, widely hated by people in the country, they're responsible for everything bad going on in England. And if we don't build a wall, I'm sorry, if we don't fight against the Irish, we're going to end up with an invasion and we will not understand the character of England as it is. The nation will be completely transformed. It will be unrecognizable to us. So we've been here before. We really have. Here's the bad news. It took an English Civil War to get through this problem. And in a very real sense, this very bloody Civil War is caused by fake news. Fake news, at least, is what gets this from a conflict that's happening in print to having people pick up swords and fight off each other. And when Parliament gets in control, they do some things to control speech. They take reasonable measures. They take the people writing these news books, they put them in pillories. They cut off their ears most often. I think it's because they were hearing gossip and sort of spreading it on. Honestly, the thing that probably does the most to try to get us out of this crisis of fake news in the 1640s is the Great Fire of 1666. Most of these presses go up in smoke. I sort of think of this as solving the Facebook problem with the California earthquake. But there is a somewhat more affirmative vision of this that comes out of this, which is the founding of the Royal Society. Immediately after the English Civil War, you have some of the great thinkers of England get together and say, look, we need to figure out what's real and true. And we need to do this independent of fear or favor from any of the political parties. We need to do this as scientists, as men of learning. We need to figure out what we should pay attention to. And they choose as their motto a very interesting phrase, nullus in verba. Trust no man's word. Don't take anyone's word for it. You need a process. You need a method. You need some way to think through this to know what you should pay attention to and what you can safely ignore. Stephen March just wrote about this in the New Yorker. He suggests that we actually inscribe this on everybody's cell phone. I think it's probably not a bad idea. So here's the thing. Everyone, I think, would like to think that they are the Royal Society. I suspect that there are people in the press who feel like they're the Royal Society. They're actually, filtering and finding the truth in all of this. I know that a lot of my friends who are over in the fact-checking land see themselves as the Royal Society and sort of trying to come up with it. I'm going to modestly suggest that another candidate for Royal Society might be those of us who are blindly stumbling and trying to figure out how this new media ecosystem works. There's a lot of us. We're starting to learn how to work together. We're trying to hold experiments to figure out how do words from ethno-nationalist groups that a lot of us thought we had eliminated in the United States filter their way into the White House or into the New York Times. And we're starting to come up with some good ways of studying how this happens. We're starting to find what I refer to as known bugs within these systems. A system like Facebook has two sets of problems. It has bad actors. It has people who show up and say, I bet I can manipulate this. I know how to get people to pay attention to me. But it also has known bugs. We know that people end up in silence behind closed doors getting more extreme in their deliberations. We know that sensationalism sells, and if you give people what they want, which is exactly what you should do if you want to make money off of this stuff, you have certain behaviors that come out of this. And so in the space of media funders, I would encourage you not just to be thinking about how do you make your message go viral, how do you use storytelling within your message, but look for some of the folks who are studying this space and trying to figure out some of these things really don't seem to be very good for us. Can we figure out how they work, and can we figure out how to counterbalance them? I mentioned that this talk was about two Bens. It's also about a Mark. We tend to understand the colonial period in terms of archetypes, right? So, Hamilton is all about archetypes, right? We now have Alexander Hamilton sort of standing up. He is the impetuous young man that we have to have control over. Washington is the war hero. He's incorruptible. He doesn't want to get thrown into politics. Franklin is the hacker, the inventor, the hustler. He's all of these things that many of us see in 21st century culture. I think we tend to look at Zuckerberg the same way. And I think Zuckerberg is basically the naive, good-intentioned hacker that we don't quite trust. Because either he's so incredibly naive about how these tools are going to end up being used, or he's a deeply deceptive guy who's sort of standing behind this cyber-utopian hope that the world is going to get better. So I feel like the Bens have a lesson or two for Mark. Franklin was an entrepreneur. He was an inventor. He was a civic visionary, founder of libraries, founders of institutions like this one, very much what Mark sees himself doing. But Franklin was also someone who subjected himself to criticism. Franklin presented his work about lightning rods to the Royal Society, started an incredible debate, amazing debate. Franklin's all for pointy lightning rods. The French are all for blunt lightning rods. This turns into politics. If you're for the pointy lightning rods, you have an American bias. If you're for the blunt ones, you have a European bias going back and forth. But Franklin subjects himself to this debate. He gets named to the Royal Society, which almost no other Americans are at this point. Turns out he's wrong. He writes movingly about electric fields and points. It turns out all to be bullshit. Actually, the blunt lightning rods are about twice as good. Takes about 200 years to figure this out, which is always nice when you can pick a fight that you'll be long dead before you get to. It would be a really good idea for folks like Zuckerberg to be exposing themselves to critique and to debate. And I don't mean standing in front of that meaningless Senate panel. I mean actually engaging with some of these other people who are trying to build very different social networks. If I could sit down with Mark, I would want to talk to him about Parleo, which is a social network that got started by Wael Ghonim, who is one of the organizers of the Arab Spring, who coming out of it said, you know what? Facebook helped us overthrow a dictator. It really did not help us form a government. If we wanted a social network that would help us organize for the future, it would have to be civil, it would have to be constructive, and we'd have to build it from the ground up to do that. I'd want him to look at Mastodon, which is this amazing distributed social network which basically says, hey, you don't like the rules, fine, start your own instance. Have your own rules, have your own community, debate about them, talk about them, and get there. I'd love for him to talk with me about Gobo, which is a tool that we built over at the MIT Media Lab, which lets you look at multiple social networks in the same place and then control how they get filtered to you. So if you want more news and less funny posts, or more fun and less news, if you want more women in your feed, we have a Mute All Men button. These are all things that you could do if you start working towards having these things work really differently. But lastly, I would want to make sure that Mark and everyone who listens to him are learning at least as much from Benjamin Rush. Because Rush used this incredible power of the bureaucracy, the power of government, the power of subsidy, to say, we don't have to just do an experiment and wait to see what happens. We can put our thumb on the scale. And you know what? That's what government's for. We might decide if we don't like what's emerging from this network, we could subsidize it, and we could favor certain types of speech. And this leads me to advocate for things that people think are entirely crazy, like public media social networks, where you have us essentially going up and saying, you know, children's television is important, we might have to pay for it. Having a public space where we can have respectful conversation, that's important too. And we might decide that we have to pay for that as well. So I want to leave you with a Franklin aphorism. Well done is better than well said. We're spending a lot of time in rooms like this talking about fake news. We're not spending nearly enough time experimenting. I'm really glad that next to the stage is my friend Eli, who's someone who's been experimenting with a lot of these different tools. I want to see us get out of talking about this. I want to see us be well done instead of well said. Thanks for listening to me.